Assalamu alaikum. Today we will deal with a very important and timely question which affects pretty much all of us in the world today, Muslims and non-Muslims. As we shall see, it is dealing with the important question, why are so many of our youth turning away from religion in general and especially the message of the Quran? And also, it is dealing with the important question, which is why the West views itself in an antagonistic relationship with the concept of Islam. As it happens, today is the 6th-year anniversary of the passing away of a great philosopher, Muslim philosopher, Professor Muhammad Qutb, who spent all of his life developing answers to such difficult questions. He developed a very critical theory based on the concept called the Prometheus complex. And don't worry about the name, we will unpack the concept in a very slow and methodical way so that we all understand it. The Prometheus complex that Professor Qutb put forward is based on the mythology of the Greeks, a story of Prometheus, which is based on the concept that there is antagonism between the gods and mankind. The gods don't want humans to learn and to develop and to become more knowledgeable, and humans perceive that the gods are their enemies. Unless they can learn, unless they can develop their own science, they cannot defeat the gods. In other words, they cannot run away from having fear of the gods. The story goes that Prometheus is a semi-god. At one point in time, Prometheus felt sorry for mankind, and he proceeded to steal from the gods what's called the flame of knowledge, and he provided it in secret to mankind. And humans used it and started developing themselves, and the gods found out, and they eventually punished Prometheus. The fear that the gods expressed is summarized by their sentence, which is, "Here is man, the more he develops, the less powerful we become." And you find that all the way until the medieval ages, the concept of acquiring knowledge was restrained, was not allowed to the commoners. Learning Latin was prohibited. Only the church elite and the upper class were allowed to learn Latin or to own books or to peruse of knowledge. That belief, that central essence of the whole concept of the Prometheus story remains and lingers in the psyche and the consciousness of Europe and the West for millennia, all the way until the beginning of the Enlightenment. With the Enlightenment, some smart people started developing some creative solutions to that conundrum that they were living in. So Descartes comes and he proposes that, okay, for the church, you can have the knowledge of theology and the relationship with God and spirituality, and allow us scientists to develop the scientific empirical knowledge based on measurement and based on studying of nature and phenomena in the physical world. And there was an agreement that allowed science, especially empirical sciences, to start flourishing with the beginning of what's called the Enlightenment period. Eventually, science progressed to the point where scientists started questioning whether or not God really does not have anything to do with nature, and then they realized that the beauty and the accuracy and the intricacy of the laws that govern nature could not be there by coincidence. You cannot have an assumption that this nature did not have a designer. So some of the scientists came back to the concept of God, and some of them, which is the second solution they came up with the concept of deism. Deism is basically the belief that there is a God, but he does not interfere in nature. He created the laws of nature, but other than that, he has nothing to do with our lives. He has nothing to do with our will, and we can do whatever we please as long as we keep him away from those issues. But we are believers. We believe in God. So they started sort of reconciling this problem that they perceived, the dualism between spirituality and rationality, because every human being knows that we are made of both. And these scientists, the deists, realize that we cannot live without God, even with nature. So they assign the laws of nature to God, but God does not interfere in the execution of these laws. And therefore, we're free to dominate nature, we're free to subdue nature, and eventually, science continued to develop to the point where some people became even more arrogant, to the point where they said, we don't need God, period. There is no God. It is just this life. It is just our time on this earth from the beginning till our death, and then there's nothing. We don't see any evidence, quote unquote, scientific evidence of the existence of God. Of course, they were wrong, but that's the arrogance speaking. And that's where the third group of people came out, and they're the atheists, the ones who called for the claim that there is no God, period. So those three groups had to deal with this basic antagonism, this basic problem that humans in the West, specifically in the West, were facing. And that's where the Prometheus complex applied. So Professor Qutb realized that the West is still suffering from this complex. And this is a phenomenal philosophical idea that really truly deserves a Nobel Prize, in my opinion. Now, Islam comes with a totally different approach. From the beginning, monotheism came with a totally different approach to this so-called antagonism between God and man. God and man, according to the Western thinking, according to the Prometheus complex, God and man are in competition, and knowledge is limited, and the more one keeps of the knowledge, the other gets weaker. So the more man develops knowledge, the less powerful God becomes, so to speak. That's the essence of the Prometheus complex. Unfortunately, a lot of the people who are born or at least educated according to the Western philosophies and Western sciences have ingrained within them that mentality, that psyche. It's a paradigm, as we explained in a prior segment. Monotheism came with a totally different solution and reframed that question in a totally different way. From the beginning, with Prophet Ibrahim realized that the very knowledge that we have must come from the same designer who has created this beautiful nature all around us, this very accurate and very specific and very predictable in many ways nature that's around us. And that's the mentality that Prophet Ibrahim expressed through monotheism. So there is one God, but that God who created all of this must have created us not to make enemies with us, not to antagonize us, not to put us down, on the opposite, to guide us and to help us grow and flourish and become better human beings. So the essence of success is to realize what that nature of being a human means, and the uniqueness of being a human, and the uniqueness of seeking support from the God who created us on our journey toward continued progress and continued development. So we see Prophet Ibrahim described in the Quran when he fought with his people who were polytheists, and he was telling them that there is only one God and he will help us. They tried to punish him and he ran away, and he said as he's running away, Inni dhahibun ila rabbi sayahdeen. I am running away toward my Lord. He is the one who shall guide me. That mentality really is a beautiful reframing of the whole problem, of the whole Prometheus complex. With Prophet Musa alayhi salam, the same thing. We see the same thing in the Quran. When Musa and the Israelites are running away from the army of Pharaoh on their exodus out of Egypt, and they run into the sea, a seemingly insurmountable obstacle. Musa stands firmly and he says, Kalla inna ma'iya rabbi sayahdeen. No, I'm not gonna give up. My Lord is with me and he shall guide me. And this is the beautiful sentiment of having this relationship of connection with the God, connection with the guidance from God, connection with the knowledge that God wants us to have. This message of monotheism continues with Prophet Muhammad, and when we open the Quran and understand the very first passage that was revealed to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we find a beautiful description of this type of relationship between mankind and God. That passage reads, اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم. Read in the name of your Lord who has created man from connections. اقرأ وربك الأكرم. Read with the help of your Lord, the generous Lord. الذي علم بالقلم. He is the one who taught with the pen. So that relationship, which introduces God in a totally new light through the Quran, begins from that very first passage and continues throughout. So we find Prophet Muhammad ﷺ elevating the necessity of a person, a Muslim, to learn to the level of the same farida or the same obligation that he uses to describe prayers or he uses to describe all acts of worship. So we hear Prophet Muhammad ﷺ saying, طلب العلم فريضة على كل مسلم. Every Muslim has the obligation of pursuing knowledge. Now, we also find the Quran encouraging mankind to ask, encouraging mankind to inquire, and even encouraging mankind to doubt and ask questions that are tough in order to pursue certainty and to reach that level of confidence in the relationship with God. This message is the essence of monotheism as far as the West is concerned. This message should be the essence of how we present Islam to the West. Unfortunately, we find that today and in the last couple of centuries, the West has heard that Islam means submission to the God. And submission to the God is framed for a Western person within the Prometheus complex. So the Western person understands submission as losing to God. In other words, in that tension, in that antagonism that the Prometheus complex describes, a typical Western person sees submission to God as defeat. They don't understand the real concept of monotheism and oneness of God and generosity of God and infinite nature of God's knowledge. That should be the message of Islam. In conclusion, I want to share with you something that Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall, one of the translators of the Quran, included in his introduction to the translation of the Quran. And he's a British person who is highly educated in the Western world. And yet when he became a Muslim, he understood that critical difference. And he understood that when Europeans abandoned their sacred books, they started flourishing. And they started developing. And they started learning more and more. In contrast, when Muslims clung to their sacred book, the Quran, they grew and they developed science and knowledge and led the world and actually helped the whole world progress. And only when Muslims started abandoning their book, they started regressing and they started losing that leadership edge in terms of science and knowledge. I hope this was useful as it was useful to me. Thank you for watching.